2018 in Bergen, Norway was unusually damp, even for a city known for its endless rain. On a fog-heavy morning in early May, two hikers wandered off a marked trail in the forest just outside the city. They were searching for a shortcut back to the road when one of them noticed a patch of ground that looked different from the rest. The soil appeared looser, slightly darker, and covered with leaves that didn't quite blend in with the surrounding forest floor. Curiosity turned to unease when a boot heel sank deeper into the ground than expected. Within minutes, the hikers realized they had stumbled upon something that didn't belong to the wilderness. Police were called, and soon a team of forensic specialists arrived at the scene. Beneath the damp soil and layers of moss lay the body of a young woman. She was dressed simply, wearing a faded blue jacket, jeans, and shoes that still looked new. Her face was pale and almost serene, her arms carefully crossed over her chest, as if she had been posed. It was not the typical brutality investigators expected from murder. Instead, it was ritualistic, deliberate, and strangely calm. The discovery sent shockwaves through the quiet community. Bergen had its share of crime, but this was different. The body showed no immediate signs of violence, no defensive wounds, no obvious trauma. Toxicology tests would take time, but initial examination suggested the victim had been preserved in a way that slowed decomposition. Whoever had buried her had taken steps to ensure her body would remain intact long enough to be discovered. The media rushed to cover the case, quickly dubbing it the Bergen Mystery. Reporters speculated wildly. Was it the work of a cult, an obsessed admirer, or a serial offender? Yet beneath the noise, forensic scientist Lisa Olsen was focused on details no one else seemed to notice. As one of Norway's most respected forensic experts, she had seen countless crime scenes. But this one unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. At the burial site, she noticed the soil around the victim's hands contained faint traces of a fine powder, something unusual for that part of the forest. Samples were collected, but nothing could be identified immediately. What stood out most to her was the deliberate positioning of the body. It wasn't just placed, it was staged. Every angle, every fold in the clothing seemed intentional. Lisa felt as if the killer had left behind a silent performance, waiting for someone with her expertise to read the meaning behind it. The victim herself was eventually identified as a 24-year-old university student who had gone missing weeks earlier. Her family had reported her disappearance, but there had been no leads until now. Investigators interviewed friends, classmates, and neighbors, but no one could provide useful information. She was described as quiet, hardworking, and kind. There were no enemies, no troubled relationships, and no history of risky behavior. It seemed impossible to understand why she had been chosen. For Lisa Olsen, however, the case was not simply about the why, it was about the how. She studied the evidence late into the night, piecing together fragments others dismissed. The strange soil, the absence of DNA, the immaculate state of the victim's clothing, all of it pointed to a killer who was not only careful but methodical. What disturbed her most was the sense that this was only the beginning. Killers who plan with this level of precision rarely stop at one victim. They leave behind patterns, and patterns always grow. As the investigation closed for the night, Lisa stood in the rain near the burial site, feeling the weight of the silence around her. The forest had given up one secret, but she knew it was holding many more. Months passed after the first discovery, and Bergen's residents tried to convince themselves that it was an isolated tragedy. The victim's funeral was quiet, marked with grief but little closure. Investigators continued to chase empty leads, combing through phone records and travel histories, but the trail grew cold. The rain-washed forests seemed to bury the memory of the case until another body surfaced. This time, the scene was even more unsettling. In November of 2018, an abandoned farmhouse outside Oslo was reported by locals for a strange odor. When police entered the building, they found a young woman lying in the center of the main room. Her body was arranged almost identically to the one discovered in Bergen. Hands crossed neatly over her chest, her head tilted slightly to the right, her clothes clean and pressed. Yet here, there was an addition that froze investigators in place. Resting on her chest was a single raven feather, dark and glossy, placed as if it were a signature. Unlike the first scene, this location carried a stronger message. The farmhouse was barren, stripped of furniture and untouched for years, yet the body lay in perfect order as though prepared for display. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, a clue suggesting the killer had cleaned the area thoroughly before placing the victim. Windows were sealed tight and dust patterns showed no signs of disturbance except for one clear path leading to the body. Whoever had done this had moved with surgical precision. Forensic tests revealed no DNA, no fingerprints, and no traceable fibers. The feather itself was authentic, not synthetic, but under the microscope it revealed something unusual. Along its shaft were faint, deliberate cuts made with a sharp instrument, almost as if someone had studied the feather before placing it. Lisa Olson examined it for hours, aware that this small detail carried weight. This was not a random flourish. It was a deliberate act of communication. By the time the second victim was identified, a university student from Oslo with no connection to the first, the public realized the grim truth. Norway might be facing a serial killer. Newspapers splashed, warnings across their front pages, and television anchors spoke of fear spreading in quiet neighborhoods. For Lisa, the announcement was not a surprise. The staging, the consistency, the care, it all pointed to someone determined to craft a recognizable pattern. She gave it a name in her reports. The Raven signature, the killer's choice of victims, troubled her most. Both were women in their early 20s, both seemingly ordinary, with no criminal ties or dangerous habits. They were not chosen out of convenience. They were chosen to fit a design only the killer understood. Lise knew from years of study that serial offenders often use symbols to assert control, to feel superior. The raven feather was more than a calling card. It was a statement of ownership, a way of telling investigators they were no longer in charge. The public demanded answers, but the investigation was already straining under the lack of evidence. Advanced forensic technology turned up nothing useful. Each trace seemed erased before it could be collected. The killer moved with an almost scientific understanding of crime scenes, anticipating every test, every search. What he left behind was not a mistake. It was what he wanted them to find. As winter deepened, fear grew across Norway. Rumors swirled about dark rituals, hidden cults, and shadowy figures who preyed on students. Lisa blocked out the noise, keeping her focus on the evidence. She studied soil samples from the farmhouse floor, comparing them to those from Bergen. Microscopic grains revealed they came from different regions, meaning the killer was mobile, selecting sites carefully rather than randomly. It became clear that the bodies were more than victims, they were messages. The forest grave had been subtle, a quiet introduction. The farmhouse, with its feather and antiseptic scent, was louder, a declaration that the raven killer was escalating. And Lisa Olson, staring at the feather under fluorescent light, realized something chilling. The killer was building a story, one body at a time. 2020. The Raven signature was no longer a theory whispered among investigators. It had become a grim reality recognized across borders. 5 more victims had been discovered, each one found in a different location, each one displayed with the same ritualistic care. Forest clearings, abandoned barns, and deserted industrial sites became the stage for the killer's work. Every scene carried the same precision, the same silent declaration of control. The feather was always present, placed as if it were a seal of authorship, a reminder that someone was orchestrating this with chilling intent. Law enforcement agencies in Norway and Sweden joined forces, but progress was painfully slow. Traditional policing seemed powerless against an offender who understood every weakness in their methods. Surveillance footage revealed nothing, tips led nowhere, and databases offered no matches. The Raven killer left no digital footprint, no traceable history. To the world, he was a phantom. To Lisa Olson, however, he was a puzzle that demanded solving. She had abandoned much of her ordinary life to pursue him. Teaching assignments at the university were set aside, her lectures replaced, with nights spent in sterile laboratories and field visits to crime scenes. Colleagues whispered about her obsession, some praising her dedication while others worried she was unraveling. But for Lisa, The case was no longer a professional duty. It had become personal. She believed the killer was challenging her directly, leaving behind scenes that only someone with her forensic eye could fully appreciate. The turning point came with the discovery of subtle details that most would overlook. On one victim's clothing, Lisa found particles of soil so minute they were invisible to the naked eye. Under a microscope, she recognized them as belonging to a very specific geological formation near the Swedish border. On another victim, she identified fragments of synthetic material embedded in the raven feather itself. These fragments were not natural. They matched the composition of laboratory gloves manufactured by only a handful of suppliers in Northern Europe. The implications were chilling. The raven killer was not just precise. He was scientifically trained. Every step of his staging showed awareness of how forensic science worked and how investigators would attempt to collect evidence. The absence of DNA, the careful cleaning, the deliberate positioning, it was not luck or instinct, it was knowledge. The killer was operating with the same technical understanding that Lisa herself relied upon. The realization gnawed at her. It meant that the person she was chasing might not be an outsider, but someone who had studied in the same halls, read the same journals, and practiced the same techniques. It was like hunting a shadow of herself. She began scouring records of past students and researchers, quietly cross-referencing names with purchasing logs from chemical suppliers and laboratories. She mapped regions near the soil samples, narrowing down possible sites where the killer might be based. Each connection pointed her closer to someone with an unsettling familiarity. The pressure weighed heavily. Families of the victims begged for closure. The media demanded answers, and her colleagues urged her to take a break. But she could not stop. Every new feather felt like a message meant for her eyes alone, a continuation of the dialogue between killer and scientist. Lisa often found herself staring at case files late into the night, the fluorescent lights buzzing above her as the silence of the laboratory pressed in. She wondered if the killer was watching her, anticipating her moves, just as she anticipated. The raven killer was no longer a faceless predator in her mind. He was someone intelligent, deliberate, and disturbingly close to her own world. The boundary between hunter and hunted blurred, and Lisa felt herself standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous. She knew the truth was near, but the closer she drew, the more she feared what she might find when the mask finally slipped. Break in the case came not through luck, but through the patient dissection of tiny details that most would dismiss. In late 2022, Lisa received a report from the Forensic Biology Unit analyzing the raven feathers. For years, they had been catalogued as natural feathers, left intentionally by the killer. But one technician noticed faint, nearly invisible incisions along the shafts. These were not random scratches. They were clean, surgical cuts, the kind produced by scalpel blades. To Lisa, the revelation was like a key fitting into a lock. The killer had been dissecting the feathers before placing them, treating each one as a specimen. He was not simply leaving behind a calling card, he was conducting an experiment in plain sight. The list of people with access to such equipment was vast, but the combination of scalpel precision, preserved remains, and rare glove fragments narrowed it to laboratories tied to advanced biological or forensic research. Lisa requested records of all purchases of the specific synthetic gloves she had identified earlier. Out of hundreds of orders, only a handful were suspicious. One name stood out sharply against the rest: Eric Nielsen. Lisa remembered him instantly. Years earlier, he had been one of her most gifted students, brilliant in both theory and practice. He had the kind of mind that thrived on complexity, always searching for problems others overlooked. But there had been warnings too. Rumors circulated about his strange experiments, his fascination with boundaries between life and death, and his lack of empathy for subjects he studied. Eventually, his academic career collapsed after he was expelled for violating ethical guidelines during a private research project. After that, he seemed to vanish. The pattern now made sense. The meticulous care, the scientific awareness, the manipulation of evidence. It all aligned with what she knew of him. As her mind replayed past lectures and late-night discussions, In the laboratory, she felt a surge of unease. She had taught him techniques that might now be used against her. The police acted quickly. Armed with warrants, they descended on Nielsen's property in the countryside, a quiet barn house surrounded by fields that looked ordinary from a distance. What they uncovered inside shattered any illusion of normalcy. Beneath the floorboards, hidden by a false panel, was a laboratory that seemed frozen in perpetual twilight. Glass containers lined the walls, filled with preserved animal specimens and unidentified remains. On a wooden board pinned with precision were dozens of raven feathers marked with cuts and annotations in small, neat handwriting. Most chilling of all was a large map mounted on the wall, marked with red circles. Each circle corresponded to the locations where victims had been found. Several other circles remained uncrossed, suggesting future sites. The pattern was deliberate, almost mathematical, as if he had been planning a sequence of deaths long before. The first body was discovered. The evidence was overwhelming, yet one crucial element was missing. Erik Nilsen himself was gone. The house was abandoned, dust gathering on work surfaces, food left untouched in the kitchen. It was as though he had anticipated the raid and vanished before the net could close around him. The discovery confirmed Lisa's worst fears, but it also deepened the mystery. If Erik had been orchestrating this elaborate performance, then the final act had not yet been played. The feathers, the bodies, the map, they all pointed to a design not yet completed. As she stood in the hidden laboratory, staring at the unfinished circles on the map, she understood that the Raven Killer was not finished. He had planned too carefully to let the story end here. March 2024, a battered car was discovered abandoned on a cliff road overlooking the Norwegian Sea. The vehicle was registered to Erik Nilsen, and inside police found a collection of personal items that seemed staged for discovery. A worn leather jacket, a broken wristwatch, and, most unsettling, a research journal filled with his handwriting. The final pages of the journal were not scientific notes, but cryptic passages that blurred the line between confession and taunt. Repeatedly, he referenced Lisa by name, describing her as the mirror and the other half of the equation. The last line read, "She studies me as I study her. The last chapter is not mine. It is hers." The scene appeared designed to suggest suicide. The cliff's edge dropped into waves that churned violently against sharp rocks, and investigators speculated that Erik had thrown himself into the sea. Yet no body was ever recovered. The currents in that part of the coast were unforgiving, capable of carrying remains miles away or pulling them beneath the surface forever. Still, the absence of physical proof left doubt hanging in the air. Many believed Erik had staged his disappearance with the same precision he had shown at every crime scene. For Lisa Olsen, the journal was both a breakthrough and a curse. She read each line carefully, feeling the weight of every word. He had written about her methods, her lectures, even her private research that was never published. It was clear he had been following her for years, not just as a student, but as a shadow watching from a distance. The victims, the feathers, the rituals, they were not only acts of violence but also messages woven into a dialogue between them. The Raven Killer had not been killing at random. He had been performing for her. When her forensic memoir was released in April 2025, the public finally learned the extent of that connection. She revealed how the evidence pointed toward Nilsen's scientific knowledge, how the soil, the feathers, and the laboratory materials had been decoded step by step. She described the hidden laboratory beneath his barn and the map marked with future sites. But what captured the world's attention was her acknowledgement of the personal link, that the killings had been staged for her eyes, each victim a message in a twisted conversation. The reaction was explosive. Some hailed her bravery, admiring the way she had pursued truth despite the psychological weight of being drawn into the killer's design. Others criticized the memoir, accusing her of feeding into the killer's obsession by making herself part of the narrative. But regardless of the debate, the story became a sensation across Europe and beyond. The Raven Killer had transcended from a local horror into a legend whispered in true crime circles. Despite the book's revelations, many questions remained unanswered. Was Erik truly dead, claimed by the sea? Or had he vanished into another, Country, waiting to continue his performance when the world least expected it. In the months following the car's discovery, no new victims appeared, yet rumors persisted. Unverified sightings of him circulated online, each one fanning the flames of speculation. Lisa herself never gave definitive answers in interviews. She always redirected questions back to the evidence, yet her silence on certain details left room for doubt. Alone at night, she admitted to herself that she sometimes felt watched, as though the game had not ended. The Raven's signature might have paused, but she could never be certain it was finished. The story closed not with resolution, but with a haunting absence. A cliffside car, a missing body, a journal that read like a farewell, and a challenge all at once. Whether Eric Nielsen was dead or alive, his presence lingered like the dark feathers he left behind, symbols of a mystery that refused to die.